All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming this afternoon. I have been contemplating this reading, but the last time it was scheduled, I thought I had COVID, and so it had to be canceled. It turned out that I just had a bad respiratory infection, so no COVID. And Joe was not well, and Cy was not well, and so forth. So I'd like to know who I'm meeting. So I know Joe Mooney, and I know Pam, and I know Mary Lou, and I know Susan, and I don't know your name.
Carolyn.
Carolyn?
And Mary DuBard.
Mary?
I'm Rosemary.
Rosemary. Are you new here?
Yes, and Lois says hello.
All right, we have to talk afterwards. All right. Okay, so I also assume you know each other. Let me just say today, this is a wonderful book. It's been highly praised and reviewed. I don't know if any of you own it yet. If you don't, you will want to know that the library, I don't know if the library here has it, but the main library, the city library has it. And Ollie is doing a course on this book this spring. So if you are intrigued by what I shared today, you may want to take the course. I had a little bit of an inkling of this through an Ollie course last fall, and she had us read segments of it, but there's so much to go over in it that I spent this morning trying to figure out which section am I going to read to you today. That's the problem of reading nonfiction. And I don't read fiction because I can never read long enough to keep track of the party, the plot and the characters and so forth. So let me just begin by saying that Heather McGee, the young woman who's in that card I'm passing around, is a, was the president of a think tank called Demos. She has testified before Congress. She contributes. You may have seen her on television. She's often on NBC's Meet the Press or some of the other programs that are interested in institutional change. She has a bachelor's in American Studies from Yale and a law degree from the University of California at Berkeley. Her specialty is the American economy and the mystery of why it so often fails the American public. From the financial crisis to rising student debt to collapsing public infrastructure, she found a common root problem: racism. It's not the most obvious problem, but it's the subtle problem underneath a lot of what we're going to talk about today. She describes it as a common denominator of our most vexing public problems, the core dysfunction of our democracy, and constitutive of the spiritual and moral crises that grip us all. But how does this happen? And is there a way out? She embarks on a deeply personal journey across the country, from Maine to Mississippi to California, tallying what we lose when we buy into the zero-sum game. The zero-sum paradigm. The idea that the progress for some of us must come at the expense of others. Along the way, she meets white people who confide in her about losing their homes, their dreams, and their shots at better jobs, to the toxic mix of American racism and greed. This is a story of how public goods in this country, from parks and pools to functioning schools, have become private luxuries, of how unions collapsed, wages stagnated, and inequality increased, and how this country, unique among the world's advanced economies, has thwarted universal health care. But in unlikely places of worship and work, McGee finds proof of what she calls the solidarity dividend, the benefits we gain when people come together across race to accomplish what we simply cannot do on our own. The sum of us is a brilliant analysis of how we arrived here, divided and self-destructing, materially rich but spiritually starved, and vastly unequal. McGee marshals economic and sociological research tools to tell us an irrefutable story of racism's costs. But at the heart of the book are the humble stories of people yearning to be part of a better America including white supremacy's collateral victims, white people themselves. With startling empathy, this heart-filled message from black women to a multiracial America leaves us with a new vision for a future in which we finally realize that life can be more than a zero-sum game. Now, where to start? It's an old story about a zero-sum hierarchy. And it starts out in her introduction. And one of the things that piqued my curiosity about her is that we come from the same part of town. We come from the same ethnic background. She was the child of a single mother, and she's probably an affirmative action baby. That is one of the people who benefited by diversity policies, which are under attack right now. So she starts out, and I think there are two parts for me, the beginning and the end. And the middle is too much for me to cover today, but I will encourage you to get this book and to go through it entirely. Joe informed me today that I have 30 minutes, so I tried to practice so that I don't run over time. Okay, so she begins. Why can't we have nice things? It was a question that struck me pretty early on in life, growing up as I did, in an era of rising inequality, seeing the wealthy neighborhoods boom while the schools and parks, where most of us lived, fell into disrepair. When I was 20 years old, I applied for an entry job at Demos, a research and advocacy organization working on public policy solutions to inequality. There I learned the tools of the policy advocacy trade: statistical work, statistical research, and white papers, congressional testimony, litigation, bill drafting, media outreach, and public campaigns. It was exhilarating. I couldn't believe that I could use a spreadsheet to convince journalists to write about the ideas and lives of the people I cared most about, the ones living from paycheck to paycheck, who needed a better deal from businesses and our government. And it actually worked. Our research influenced members of Congress to introduce laws that helped real people and led to businesses changing their practices. I went off to get a law degree and came right back to Demos to continue the work. I fell in love with the idea that information in the right hands was power. I geeked out on the intricacies of the credit markets and a gracefully designed regulatory regime. My specialty was economic policy, and as indicators of economic inequality became starker year after year, I was convinced that I was fighting the good fight for my people and for everyone who struggled. And that is how I saw it. Part of my sense of urgency about the work was that my people, black people, are disproportionately ill-served by bad economic policy decisions. I was going to make better ones. I came to view the relationship between race and inequality, as most people in my field do, linearly. Structural racism accelerates inequality for communities of color. When our government made bad economic decisions for everyone, the results were even worse for people already saddled with discrimination and disadvantaged. Take the rise of household debt in working and middle-class families, the first issue I worked on at Demos. The volume of credit card debt Americans owed had tripled over the course of the 1990s, and among cardholders, Black and Latinx families were the most likely to be in debt. In the early 2000s, when I began working on the issue, bankruptcies and foreclosures were rising, and homeowners, particularly Black and brown homeowners, were starting to take equity out of their houses through strange new mortgage loans. But the problem of burdensome debt and abusive lending wasn't registering on the radar of enough decision makers. Few politicians in Washington knew what it was like to have bill collectors incessantly ringing their phones about balances that kept growing every month. So in 2003, Demos launched a project to get their attention. The first ever comprehensive research report on the topic with big, shocking numbers about the increase in debt. The report included policy recommendations about how to free families from debt and avoid financial meltdown. Our data resulted in newspaper editorials, meetings with banks, congressional hearings, and legislation to limit credit card rates and fees. 2 years later, Congress took action and made the problem of rising debt worse. Legislators passed a bankruptcy reform bill supported by the credit industry that made it harder for people ever to escape their debts, no matter how tapped out they were after a job loss, catastrophic medical illness, or divorce. The law wasn't good for consumers. It did nothing to address the real problems in family finances and actually made the problem worse. It was a bad economic policy decision that benefited only the lenders and the debt collectors, not the public. This was a classic example of the government not doing the simple thing that aligned with what most Americans wanted or what the data showed was necessary to solve a big problem. Instead, it did the opposite. Why? Well, for one thing, our inability to stop bankruptcy reform made me realize the limits of research. The financial industry and other corporations had spent millions on lobbying and campaign donations to gin up a majority in Congress. And many of my fellow advocates walked away convinced that big money in politics was the reason we couldn't have nice things. And I couldn't disagree. Of course money had influenced the outcome. But I'll never forget something that happened on the last day I spent at the Capitol presenting DEMO's debt research to members of Congress. I was walking down the marble hallway of the Russell Senate office building in my new professional shoes. I was 25 years old when I stopped to adjust them because they kept slipping off. I thought you'd say hurting my feet. When I bent down, I was near the door of a Senate office. I honestly can't remember if it belonged to a Republican or a Democrat. I heard the bombastic voice of a man going on about the deadbeats who had babies with multiple women and then declared bankruptcy to dodge the child support, using the government to avoid personal responsibility. There was something in the senator's invective that made my heart speed up. I stood and kept moving, my mind racing. Had we advocates entirely missed something about the fight we were in? We had been thinking of it as a class issue, with racial disparities, of course. But it was possible, at least for some of the folks on the other side of the issue, coded racial stereotypes were a more central player in the drama than we knew. I left Capitol Hill watching the rush hour crush of mostly white people in suits and sneakers, heading home after a day's work in the halls of power, and I felt stupid. Of course, it's not as if the credit card companies had made racial stereotypes an explicit part of their communication strategy on bankruptcy reform. But I had my political coming of age in the mid-1990s, when the drama of the day was, quote, ending welfare as we know it, end quote. Words that helped Bill Clinton hold on to the white political center by scapegoating black single mothers for not taking, quote, personal responsibility to escape poverty. There was nothing explicit or conclusive about what I'd overheard, but perhaps the bankruptcy reform fight, also like welfare, about the deservingness and character of people with little money, was playing out in that same racialized theater for at least one decision maker, and maybe more. I felt frustrated with myself for being caught flat-footed, literally with shoe in hand, and missing a potential strategic vulnerability of the campaign. I'd learned about research and advocacy and lobbying in the predominantly white world of nonprofit think tanks. But how could I have forgotten the first lessons I ever learned as a black person in America about what they see when they see us, about how quick so many white people would be inclined to assume the worst of us, and to believe that we wanted to cheat at a game that they were winning fair and square. I hadn't even thought to ask the question about this seeming non-racial financial issue. But had racism helped defeat us? Years later, I was on a conference call with 3 progressive economists, all white men. It was 2010, and we were plotting the research strategy for a huge project about the national debt and budget deficit. Both measures were on the rise, as the Great Recession had decimated tax revenue while requiring more public spending to restart the economy. The Tea Party had burst onto the political stage, and everyone, from conservative politicians to the kind of Democrats who had President Obama's ear, were saying that we needed a, quote, grand bargain to create a dramatically smaller government by 2040 or 2050, including cuts to Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare. We were preparing the numbers to show that such a bargain would be a death blow to a middle class that was already on its knees, and to offer an alternative budget proposal that would include a second stimulus and investments to grow the middle class. Toward the end of our planning call, I cleared my throat into the speakerphone. Quote, so when we're talking about the fiscal picture in 2040 or 2050, we're also talking about a demographic change tipping point. So where should we make the point that all these programs were created without concern for their costs when the goal was to build a white middle class? And they paid for themselves in economic growth. And now these days, these guys are trying to fundamentally renege on the deal for a future middle class that would be majority people of color. Nobody spoke. I checked in to see if I'd been muted. No, the light on the phone was still green. Finally, one of the economists spoke into the awkward silence. Well, sure, Heather. We know that, and you know that. But let's not lead with our chin here. We're trying to be persuasive. I found the mute button again and pressed it and screamed. Then I laughed a little and I sighed. At least that economist had said the quiet part out loud for me, for once. He was just expressing the unspoken conventional wisdom in my field, that it will be less successful if we explicitly call out the racial unfairness or reminded people that the United States had deliberately created a white middle class through racially restricted government investments in home ownership and infrastructure and retirement security, and that it had only recently decided that keeping up those investments would be unaffordable and unwise. What was worse, I didn't have the confidence to tell my colleagues that they were wrong about the politics of it. They were probably right. Nearly all the decision makers in our target audience were going to be white, from the journalists we wanted to cover our research, to the legislative staff we'd met with, to the members of Congress who would vote on our proposal. Even under a black president, we were operating within a white power structure. Before long, the Tea Party movement used the language of fiscal responsibility, but the cultural organizing of white grievance to force a debt ceiling showdown, mandate blunt cuts to public programs during a fragile recovery, and stall the legislative function of the federal government for the rest of Obama's presidency. Was it possible that even when we didn't bring up race, it didn't matter? That racism could strengthen the hand that beat us, even when we were advocating for policies that would help all Americans, including white people? On the day Donald Trump was to take the oath of office in 2017, I'd been the president of Demos for 3 years. I was gearing up to fight against the onslaught that Trump's incoming administration portended for civil rights and liberties, for immigrants and Muslims, and for the Black Lives Matter movement he had gleefully attacked in his campaign. But as an economic policy advocate, I also knew that the Trump agenda, from appealing the Affordable Care Act to cutting taxes for big corporations and the wealthy, Apparently, the concern for the national debt expired with the Obama presidency. To stopping action on climate change, which would have catastrophic economic and social costs for the country and the world, was going to do damage across the board. It would create more economic inequality. Why would white voters have rallied to the flag of a man whose agenda promised to wreak economic, social, and environmental havoc on them along with everybody else? It just didn't add up. The inadequacy of the tool I was bringing to this question, economic policy research, felt painfully obvious. Contrary to how I was taught to think about economics, everybody wasn't operating in their own rational economic self-interest. The majority of white Americans had voted for a worldview supported not by a different set of numbers than I had, but by a fundamentally different story about how the economy works, about race and government, about who belongs and who deserves, about how we got here and what the future holds. That story was more powerful than cold economic calculations, and it was exactly what was keeping us from having nice things. To the contrary, it had brought us Donald Trump. So I made an unexpected decision. I decided to hand over the reins and start plotting a journey, one that would take me across the country and back again for the next 3 years. I began calling experts not on public policy, but on public opinion, the psychology and the politic proclivities of people. What makes us see the world in certain ways? What compels us to act? What drives us toward or against certain social solutions to our big problems? Before I left, I had Demos' partner with a critical race scholar and a linguist develop our own public opinion research on race, class, and government. More importantly, I leaned on the relationships that I built over the years with grassroots and labor organizers who introduced me to Americans of all backgrounds who were willing to talk to me about how they were making sense of one another and their futures. I remain guided by the same mission I had when I started at Demos, nearly 2 decades prior, changing the rules to bring economic freedom to those who lack it today. But I wouldn't be treating the issues as cut and dried dollars and cents questions, but questions of belonging, competition, and status. Questions that, in this country, keep returning to race. In my gut, I've always known that laws are merely expressions of society's dominant beliefs. It's the beliefs that must shift in order for outcomes to change. When policies change in advance of the underlying beliefs, we are often surprised to find that the problem is still with us. America ended the policy of enforced school segregation 2 generations ago, but with new justifications. The esteem in which many white parents hold black and brown children has not changed much. And today our schools are nearly as segregated as they were before Brown versus the Board of Education. Beliefs matter. So what is the stubborn belief that needs to shift now for us to make progress against inequality? I found my first clues in a series of psychology studies. Psychologists Maureen Craig and Jennifer Richardson presented white Americans with news stories about people of color becoming the majority of the population by 2042. The study authors then asked the subjects to, quote, indicate their agreement with the idea that increases in racial minority status will reduce white American status, end quote. The people who agreed most strongly that demographic change threatened white status were most susceptible to shifting their policy views because of it, even on race-neutral policies like raising the minimum wage and expanding health care, even drilling in the Atlantic. in the Arctic. The authors concluded that making the changes and making the changing national racial demographics salient led to white Americans, regardless of political affiliation, to endorse conservative policy positions more strongly. I immediately thought of the Deficit Project and of my white colleagues' resistance to stating the obvious about demographic change for fear it would backfire and make austerity more popular. 6 years later, there it was. That fear corroborated in a psychological experiment. Thinking about a more diverse future changed white Americans' policy preferences about government. It was a dramatic finding, but it still wasn't clear to me why white people would view the presence of more people of color as a threat to their status, as if racial groups were in a direct competition, where progress for one group was an automatic threat to another. And it was even more baffling to me to see how that threat could feel so menacing that these white people would resist policies that would benefit them, just because they might also benefit people of color. Why would they allow a false sense of group competition to become a self-defeating trap? But then again, they weren't getting that idea out of nowhere. The zero-sum paradigm was the default framework for conservative media. Quote, makers and takers, taxpayers and freeloaders, handouts, special favors. They're coming after your job, your safety, your way of life. Without the hostile intent, of course, aren't we all talking about race relations through a prism of competition? Every advantage for one group mirrored by a disadvantage for another? When researching and writing about disparities, I was taught to focus on how white people benefited from systemic racism. Their schools have more funding. They have less contact with the police. They have greater access to health care. Those of us seeking unity told that version of the zero-sum story. The politicians seeking division told the other version. Is it any wonder that many white people saw race relations through the lens of competition? But was that the real story? Black people and other people of color certainly lost out when we weren't able to invest more in the aftermath of the Great Recession, or tackle climate change more forcefully under President Obama, or address the household debt crisis before it spiraled out of control. In each case, at least partly because of racist stereotypes and dog whistles used by our opposition. But did white people win? No. For the most part, they lost right along with the rest of us. Racism got in the way of all of us having nice things. If I look back at all the vexing problems I'd worked on in my career, student debt, workers' rights, money in politics, unfair taxes, predatory lending, low voter turnout, would I find the fingerprints of racism on all our setbacks and defeats? It is progressive economic conventional wisdom that racism accelerates inequality for communities of color. But what if racism is actually driving inequality for everyone? This book recounts my journey to tally the hidden costs of racism to us all. It starts where my own journey began, trying to understand how the rules of our economy became so tilted toward the already wealthy and powerful. The people of our country are so productive and generate so much wealth, but most of the gains go to a small number, while most families struggle to stay afloat. I traveled to Mississippi and sat with factory workers trying to unite a multiracial workforce to bargain collectively for better pay and benefits. I talked to white homeowners who had lost everything in a financial crisis that began with predatory mortgages that banks first created to strip wealth from black and brown families. I heard from white parents and students who feared that segregated white schools would render them ill-equipped for a diverse world. To understand when white America had turned against government, I traveled to one of the many places where the town had drained its public swimming pool rather than integrate it. In each of these places, the white people's neighbors and co-workers of color struggled more because of racism. The Latinx factory worker is paid less for the same work. Black ownership rates are nearly 30-year lows, while white levels are on the way back. The black child in the segregated school has far more barriers to overcome. The loss of public goods at a time of integration means that families of color never got to enjoy that kind of government largesse. An example of that just came up recently. Black farmers, whose lands have been taken ever since the Civil War without compensation, and who, when the current government and the Congress passed a bill that the Federal Department of Agriculture should make special grants to adversely affected black farmers, white farmers protested. But the white farmers had been getting FDA grants ever since the Civil War. As a descendant of, that's what they mean by families of color never got the benefits of government largesse. The same is true of the GI Bill of Rights, okay, and other homeowner loan powers. As a descendant of enslaved Africans and of a line of black Americans who were denied housing, equal education, jobs, and even safety from white lynch mobs, I'm well aware that the ledger of racial harms is nowhere near balanced. I know the risks I'm taking by widening the aperture to show the costs of white supremacy to our entire society. This book amasses evidence for a part of the story. I believe we are neglecting at our peril, but rather than shift focus from racism's primary target, I hope the story brings more people's eyes and hearts to the cause. Black writers before me, from James Baldwin to Toni Morrison, have made the point that racism is a poison first consumed by its concoctors. What's clearer now in this time of growing inequality is that the economic benefit of the racial bargain is shrinking for all but the richest. The logic that launched the zero-sum paradigm, I will profit at your expense, is no longer sparing millions of white Americans from the degradations of American economic life as people of color have always known it. As racist structures force people of color into the mines as the canary, racist indifference makes the warnings we give go unheeded. From the war on drugs to the financial crisis to climate disasters. The coronavirus epidemic is a tragic example of governments and corporations failing to protect black, brown, and indigenous lives, though if they had, everyone would have been safer. I'll admit that my journey was deeply personal too. At its best, this country brings together all the world's peoples and invites them to make something new. Collisions of cultures have stretched the branches of my black family over the years, so that it now includes white, Asian, and Latinx people too. I started my journey when I was pregnant with a child whose grandparents would be black, white, and South Asian. I'm sure that some part of me doesn't want to believe that oppression of people of color is an unalloyed good for white people, making us truly separate and intrinsically at odds. Because then, multiracial America that made my son possible is doomed. The logical extension of the zero-sum story is that a future without racism is something white people should fear because there will be nothing good for them in it. They should be arming themselves, as they have been in record numbers, excuse me, for, quote, protection since the Obama presidency, because demographic change will end in a dog-eat-dog race war. Obviously, this is not the story we want to tell. It's not even what we believe. The same research I found showing that white people increasingly see the world through a zero-sum prism show that black people do not. African Americans just don't buy that our gain has come at the expense of white people. And time again, history has shown that we're right. The civil rights victories were so bitterly opposed in the South and ended up being a boon for the region, resulting in stronger local economies, more investments in infrastructure and in education. The old zero-sum paradigm is not just counterproductive, it's a lie. I started my journey on the hunt for its source and discovered that it has only ever served a narrow group of people. To this day, the wealthy and the powerful are still selling zero-sum stories for their own profit, hoping to keep people with much in common from making cause with one another. But not everyone is buying it. Everywhere I went, I found that the people who had replaced the zero-sum with a new formula of cross-racial solidarity had found the key to unlocking what I began to call a solidarity dividend, from higher wages to cleaner air made through possible collective action, and the benefits weren't only external. I didn't set out to write about the moral costs of racism, but they kept showing themselves. There's a psychic and emotional cost to the tightrope white people walk, clutching their identity as good people, when all around them is suffering that they don't know how to stop. But that is done, it seems, in their name for their benefit. The forces of division seek to harden this guilt into racial resentment. When I met people who had been liberated by facing the truth and working toward racial healing in their communities. And that's the story of the zero-sum game.